Okay, so let's start. Well, welcome to Peace Week. And as many of you know, Peace Week brings together faculty, students, um, and collaborators to focus on some of the most pressing issues of dealing with the advancement of peace and justice in the world. And this event, oh, and the title, the theme for this week's events is conflict resolution in a changing and uncertain world. So the current event that you're participating in now is countering violent extremism. And this is absolutely central to the general theme of changing an uncertain world because extremism obviously represents a force that fosters that, and it in itself, extremism is itself undergoing change. So the event today, we are focusing on basically the kind of the underpinnings of extremist violence in the United States. And there's many, many various factors and motivations, and of course, the many impacts, many uh, basically forces that try to foster change, much of which is violent, not all of it is violent, but it has actually had a kind of contagion effect in society, that many of the characteristics of extremism have spread through, as it were, mainstream institutions in society. So for today's event, we are focusing on one very prominent extremist group called the Proud Boys. And we're going to take a deep dive into who they are, why they participate in various kinds of protests, and in many cases, violent protests, and how can we imagine their transformation from violence to peaceful engagement in society. So the schedule for this event is I will start the discussion with an overview of the Proud Boys as they are operating today, and try to and offer some analysis of what really drives them and who they are. Then we will turn to the lab manager, Randy Lyos, who is obviously participating in this event right now. And he's going to show an interview that we have had, we did actually yesterday, with Michael Primo, who produced an amazing film, a documentary called Homegrown, about the evolution of three members of the Proud Boy organization. And this is a remarkable film where he engaged with Proud Boys over more than a 3 year period, including the events of January 6th at the Capitol. And uh, so we'll be watching a video of that conversation that Randy and I had with Michael. Um, After the conversation that we are showing, Randy will give his analysis and offer insights about modes of positive transformation that are possible and very promising for not just the Proud Boys, but violent extremist groups in the United States. Um, just in terms of advertising, we did advertise that Libby Langsdale will participate in this event, but she is not able to participate in this event. So we're not going to be focusing on the Oath Keepers as we mentioned in the description, but I think that some of the themes that we draw out today are applicable to the Oath Keepers and to many um, other extremist groups. So I'm going to start with offering a few observations about the Proud Boys and share my screen and
Yep, you're good.
okay. All right. So let's start. Um, So, quick overview, very quick, that there are 1,430 hate groups in the United States as of 2023. And this is an increase from the years before, and I know that there's an increase even in 2024. This according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. And a hate group basically is defined as the indication as a group that targets a certain population group for various forms of assault. Some of the assault can be verbal, but of course some can be physical and forms of denigration. And here's a map by the Southern Poverty Law Center that indicates just the wide-ranging geographic location of hate group. They're not limited to rural areas. They're not limited to any single state. You can see so many groups in the northeast of the United States and Florida, California. So we can't stereotype some states basically tend to foster more because of the state's liberal leaning, like California. They have a lot of hate groups. Virginia has 45 hate groups, for example. Some are very close to in their home offices to George Mason University, even. So there's an enormous range of ideologies among these 1,400 or so hate groups that it's very difficult really to narrow down to a single ideology. Some groups are anti-government groups, that is the Oath Keepers, and many other groups. There's many groups that are called patriot groups, Patriot Front, and so on. And they claim that the federal government is engaged in totalitarian practices, that they claim that concentrations have already been constructed for true patriots. Then another category, general hate groups, that is groups that engage in anti-student inclusion activities and basically as part of the modern parental rights movement. A third category, of course, the well-known category of white nationalist groups, where the claim is that the United States is overrun by certain non-white groups. The goal was for a white ethno-state. A fourth is neo-Confederate groups, um, and um, and I should say that the Southern Poverty Law Center also includes a category called anti-fascist groups as hate groups. So these are very few groups that are operative today, but they are operating. And these are anti-authoritarian groups and anti-capitalist groups. And then another category are male supremacist groups who argue that the feminists and liberals in running the government are engaged in a campaign to oppress man's natural state of supremacy. And this is relevant. So here's a chart that indicates the kinds of violence, the attacks and plots by different category groups. So just very quickly, the light blue in this graph, it represents the number of attacks in these years. You see 1994 to 2001, the number of attacks by violent far right groups in 2021. That has the most number of attacks. But the far left group is this light green color, consists of violent attacks by far left. So it's not insignificant, but clearly the far right groups engage in more numbers of attacks. So illustrated here by the Proud Boys. So the Proud Boys, a group that was formed in 2016 with the elevation, political ascendancy of Donald Trump. It was formed by Gavin McInnes, who is a Canadian. He had a radio show in Canada and expanded his influence. And it was based on two primary commitments. One is to foster Western chauvinism. That's a term they use, basically saying that they are proud of the creation of the modern world by Western Europeans and their descendants, that including white Christian Americans. The second main theme is that they are very critical of feminists who they claim are basically dismantling men from their natural position of supremacy. They also claim to be not committed to racial, religious, or ethnic stereotyping or bigotry. They claim that, but clearly some of their members do promote that. So here's some pictures which indicate how they often dress and they take on the persona of kind of militaristic clothing. So in picture number 3, the man with the jacket and tie is Gavin McInnes. And in picture number 4 is a protest in December of 2020, before the January 6th incursion. They did a number of protests in Washington, D.C. And so I want to Okay, so I want to suggest that one of their themes, I'm going to use this slide first. So we did an analysis of their verbatim statements from a variety of sources. And I just want to mention just very quickly, I know there's a lot of words, there's too many words on this slide, but I just want to go through very quickly some of the main themes from their own words. So the first one on the top, we brought roads and infrastructure to India, and they're still using them as toilets. Our criminals built nice roads in Australia, but Aborigines keep using them for bed, and so on. The next one, why don't we take back Bethlehem? Why don't we take back Northern Ireland? Why don't we start our own crusades? That's what the crusades were. Um, and we're not just someone picking on Muslims for no reason. The next one here, the third one down on the left, I'm not afraid to speak out about the atrocities that whites and people of European descent face, not only here in this country, but in Western nations across the world. Fourth one, the truth minority in this world are whites. White children are less than 3% of the world's population, and white majority are on a pathway to extinction. The fifth one, on the list here. The heroes of Black Lives Matter and Antifa are degenerate criminal lowlifes and pedophile rapists. I don't lose any sleep when they're just removed from society. Next one, our forefathers died in a battle to protect freedom. At least we can do is to be inconvenienced. Next, the time is now. We're going to have to get some swollen fists. We're going to have to fight. And the one on the bottom here, all I want to do is smash commies too. Actually, I'm lying. I'm way past just hitting them. When the time comes, I will stop at nothing to fully eradicate them all. So these are typical statements of Proud Boys. And I want to draw out from these statements 4 themes that emerge, obviously just from a few cases, but I think these themes are emblematic of many of the sentiments and beliefs of many groups, not all of them, but many. First theme, the Proud Boys are obsessed with injustices, and this is not unusual for extremist groups. They have injustice narratives that ripple through um, their public statements, their conversations, and the injustices basically focus on, as it were, the enemy groups. So, first, white people are experiencing genocide. Obviously, the injustice of that. Uh, Next, Europe is engaged in a war against Muslims. So obviously Muslims basically become the source of various injustice and threats. Um, another statement about Western civilization. This war, the narratives basically repeat the war uh, imagery, a war against whites, a war against Westerners by non-Westerners. Next is multicultural groups are dangerous to the US. Democrats are communists, Democrats committing various forms of injustice, including creating these concentration camps that I mentioned. And of course, China comes up often as a threat. So this is a theme that runs through um, much of their communication. A second theme is that these injustices are layered with sentiments of righteous rage. And righteous rage is basically an intense anger that is directed at somebody, an adversary, uh, and who are accused of committing various forms of injustice. This is a very common sentiment and very powerful sentiment among the Proud Boys. And I have just some references here, repeating what I said before. All I want to do is smash commies too. And rage is very exciting. Rage is almost alluring because it's an individual expression of anger, obviously, but it's politicized. So it's a balance between individual intense emotion that's rationalized as a political necessity. That it becomes a source of bringing groups together, bringing possible recruiting members to the group, and obviously a source of hatred against the enemy. And this is one kind of rage. You see this picture of this obviously often shown picture of the attackers um, just before they attacked the U.S. Capitol. So one form of rage is actually this physical expression, but my point is that this rage has a politically contagion impact that just ripples through the group and it becomes almost a political imperative to express and show rage. So a third theme is existential transformation. And this means basically the attempt to change the fundamental categories of the world. That is, to change the nature of existence of the uh, certainly of the enemy group and even themselves. So when they talk about Democrats, for example, they have this delusional uh, characterization of Democrats as communists. When they talk about feminists, they have this kind of bizarre notion that feminists are destroying society. Similarly with Muslim, of course, obviously one category that I hadn't mentioned yet is, of course, the threats from immigrants from south of the border. They have layers and layers of fabricated notions of immigrants and, of course, communists. So existential transformation consists of a power to contort the identity, positionality, placement, status, character traits, and history of population groups. It's an attempt to change the world. In my opinion, it is as if they take on the Proud Boys acquire a magical power to influence the evolution of events and even characterize the world in extremely negative and grossly overly simplistic terms. It provides this existential transformation offers psychological comfort in creating a world of their own creation. That is, a world motivated by intense emotion, desires, hopes, and rage. And I want to emphasize that this is a world that is created out of their righteous rage. And it is very alluring. A fourth theme I want to call epistemic sanctification. And that's a rather technical term, maybe clunky term, to represent something that I think is quite familiar. And that is the view that certain beliefs by the Proud Boys are treated as sacred dogma. They're cast as infallible. They're beyond doubt. They are impossible to refute by scientific evidence. There is no possible scientific evidence that is, in normal rational terms, is going to undermine the sanctity of these sacred beliefs. And these are, I'm talking about the primary principles, primary beliefs that define the Proud Boys. These are beliefs that are worthy of devotion, veneration, and worship. There's a kind of religiosity, a religious devotion to these beliefs. And of course, they often invoke polarizing dualities of good and evil, virtuous, vicious, and pure and impure, about the enemy and about themselves. And yet, at the same time, these beliefs are removed from reality. That is, there's no capacity to check these beliefs by any so-called neutral method of validation or refutation. It is epistemic emancipation. These they escape the complexity and uncertainty of knowing the real world. And of course, these are beliefs that are worth fighting over. These are beliefs that basically, when challenged, become the source of their righteousness, self-righteousness. And so, in summary, what this quick review of the Proud Boys illustrates are four characteristics that underpin their violence: the injustice narratives, the righteous rage, the ontological transformation, epistemic sanctification. These are beliefs that, in a way, they constitute a kind of violence of the mind, a violence that infects the mind of these extremists. And of course, it's violence that is contagious. And that is all I want to say for now. So thank you for your attention. And I'm going to turn now to the manager of our lab. I neglected to mention that this event is sponsored by our Peace Lab, Polarization and Violence Transformed. And my partner in moving this forward is Randy Lyos, and he's going to show the recording, as I mentioned, of Michael Primo.
All right. Thanks so much, Dan. And thanks for this opportunity. I really enjoyed the interview that we had with Michael yesterday, and so very excited to show it to you folks today. Just a quick note on this: there was there was one uh, element there where that I have to correct because yesterday I mentioned a movie that we're going to be showing at our upcoming summit for the Delta Network. So Delta stands for the Depolarization Labs and Trainers Alliance. This is a network of academics that are focused on polarization around the DMV area, and we'll actually be talking about that a little bit later at the end of the session. And I mentioned that we're going to be watching a movie called Just for Us. That's going to be at that summit, and it's going to be happening next Friday. So I misspoke in this interview. We're not going to be doing that in this session, but we will be doing that at the summit. So aside from that, please enjoy this video. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing that. Well, welcome, Michael. Thanks so much for joining us. It was really great to see your movie, and I think it was an extraordinary effort to really document the phenomenon that we have studied a lot at our lab. So I really appreciate your joining us for this interview.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time to check out the film, and I'm excited to be in conversation.
Yeah, so I wanted to start out by thinking about the relationship that you built with who were in the movie. It followed three different members of the Proud Boys as they were in the lead up to January 6th, and you followed them throughout. And I wanted to ask you about the process of building that relationship with them. It seemed like you had earned their trust. And so how did you build that relationship, and what sort of movie did they think that they were actually signing up for?
Yeah, so with all our work, it's really important to be honest, present some level of accountability to the people that we are inviting to participate, or asking them to let us into our lives. We started in 2018, the process of trying to identify protagonists and film participants who we thought were particularly compelling or doing things that were fit our general inquiry, which was we wanted to understand why different people were fighting for this country, or how they conceived of fighting for this country, and for people that felt like violence might be justified. And that's what we told people, and that's what we were interested in doing. We're really interested in this question of political violence and why people feel it's justified. And we told people that. And people, some people were skeptical, certainly, of what we were doing, and other people, sort of, when we told them what we were doing, sort of launched in to their explanation of why they were doing what they're doing, and why they feel like, maybe sometimes nonviolence is perhaps limited, and we need to fight because of XYZ. And that's what people told us. And so the other thing that about our approach is spending a lot of time with people and telling people that we are genuinely interested in trying to understand what motivates them, where they come from, what they value, and what they're looking for, what they're seeking. And that's how we approach people.
Oh yeah, so you definitely, communicated that you were looking for genuine understanding, and it looks like you that was really fruitful, that it really paid off and helped to build that relationship and build that trust. And as you mentioned, you watched these guys for so long, and I'm wondering how their narratives of the world seem to change over time, since it did seem to evolve a bit from the beginning of the movie to the end at varying levels, for each one of these folks. So how would you say that their narrative about the world had evolved?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I mentioned, we started in 2018, and we filmed with about a dozen people across the country. And so by the time we came to the edit, we had to make some tough choices around who is actually going to be in the final film, because there's only so many ideas that your brain can hold within a 2-hour film. And so how we ended up making that decision was largely informed by the people themselves. And what worked within the sort of confines of a 2-hour film was people who are in some type of direct relationship to each other, either if they're actually know each other as Chris and Randy, two of the participants in the film, or are they part of the same organization, like Thad, the third Proud Boy who's in the film, and who sort of intersects at similar events. And so that sort of dictated who was in the film, and also where we were sort of entering their lives in terms of their trajectory and the narrative of what they thought they were engaged in. And so, having started the film in 2018, we saw this arc happened as people who were like Chris, who's in the film, for example, who before 2016 self-identified as someone who was never interested in politics, never really paid attention. But there was something about Trump descending down that golden elevator that just really excited him. And he slowly became more and more involved. He started consuming more and more news and podcasts and media, social media around what was going on. And so what we experienced was people feeling more and more sort of like cautious, worried that the outcome of the election might not necessarily go their way. Certainly early on, they were sort of really confident that it would go their way, but as things got sort of closer to the election, there was this sort of palpable anxiety building. And we really sort of like tried to sort of see how chart that process of folks becoming increasingly skeptical of the system.
Oh yeah. I imagine that a big part of what you were watching was the construction of identities. That's definitely something that is very central to our work. Identity has such a central role within conflict. So I would love you to talk about if they had it seemed like there had for some of them been a loss of a previous identity before they joined the Proud Boys. And I would love to hear how you feel like their identities changed over time and which identities maybe became more or less salient for them.
That's a really interesting question. So I would say that like one of the things that we hope comes across in the film is this notion that is speaks to why people become involved in some of these groups and some of these movements. And I think the way we sort of think about history and also the way often that history is taught through these sort of major events, often there's like some man who sort of does something and then there's some consequence socially. But the average person becomes involved in these things not because of ideology or some sort of grand scheme. It's often people that are looking for community, belonging, purpose, and those are all those things wrapped up in how you what you describe as identity. And so we saw people who were looking for community and struggling to sort of like articulate who they are and what they are and what they want. And so we saw that through people finding this community, they were able to sort of like elaborate and identify kind of markers or indicators or what, for lack of a better word, are ways that they could perform like ideas of what they thought their identity could be or should be or was. And very often in conservative communities, they sort of situate their relationship to their identity in relationship to some sort of other that's either preventing their identity from fully realizing its potential or is threatening its sort of very real its existence in a sort of existential kind of way. And what we saw is people like Chris, who, he wasn't sort of necessarily fully political and or engaged in politics or aware of politics on a sort of national level. And he very quickly sort of subsumed this idea of national politics as a part of his core identity. His relationship to this political landscape suddenly became how he was identifying as a person. And he is somebody who his entire life, he's just wanted to matter. He's wanted to do things that are of consequence to his family and to his community. And so his sort of identification with this national figure was a way for him to sort of like flex that identity to mean something, to do something of consequence that would help, this national dream, quote unquote, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, you wanted to jump
Yeah,
in?
that is such a great theme, and it really came out very clearly in the film, and we've seen that with other extremist groups, information we have. Um, did you feel, and it's really amazing that you spent almost 3 years on this, right? Or more than 3 years in filming. And you obviously did so much work, how many years, I don't know, ahead of time to prepare for this. Did you experience them feeling fulfilled in their participation in the Proud Boys or not fulfilled? Did it go through different range of kind of positive experience with respect to those identity markers that you just mentioned? Was it fulfilling or was it not fulfilling, or how did it evolve over the 3 years?
That's a great question. I feel like it was very fleeting. It ebbed and flowed. I think this is, there's probably a few major religions that have wrestled with this question of sort
Yeah,
of
for thousands of years.
yeah. So, I think anytime you're sort of looking for external gratification, it can be very fleeting and very hard. And that's what I experienced them experiencing, where, in large groups or even in their sort of weekly meetups with other sort of like-minded conservatives, they would be very satisfied, and they sort of that
Oh,
adrenaline
they were.
rush of being around a bunch of folks who all feel the same way you feel and validate you, and you feel seen, you feel heard, you feel understood. And then it becomes this thing where you're kind of chasing that high, so to speak. And going to rallies and meetings and those public demonstrations where you're publicly performing your identity is thrilling. And that's like you're kind of chasing that dragon. That's kind of what I experienced them doing. Because sort of after January 6th, it was just like
Yeah,
a crash. It was just such a,
right.
it was we gave it our all and it didn't, so.
Yeah.
Well, can I ask another question, Randy?
Please go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, that was really fascinating about the film is after the 6th. And that night they were actually having dinner, outdoor barbecue. And some of them even said, and this was very brief in the film, that they were annoyed or worse that Trump didn't go to the Capitol.
Yeah.
And a number of Proud Boys, and I know this from other sources, basically disavowed their
Yep.
affiliation with Trump, at least,
Yep.
because of that. I don't know how many, but at least some did.
Hmm. Yeah, that was a very uh, broad sentiment shared by people across the movement that night, at least. Who, because this was planned in public. It was a mass movement, and folks, sort of collectively were signaling that the only way for them to quote unquote stop the steal would be to sort of for Trump to sort of march triumphantly into the rotunda, be greeted by Ted Cruz and other colleagues who are all sort of before the certification indicating that they would not certify. And when that did not happen, that was just the rage was directed at Trump for not following on through on what
Mhm.
said on what he said he would do. Of course,
Yeah.
that was short-lived, but
Well, and you've been in contact with some of these folks since that time, and also I assume others within the movement, perhaps who had disavowed Trump afterwards. Do you have a sense of how many of those folks have come back into the fold and decided, well, no, this was an important enough a part of my identity that I want to re-embrace the movement? How many of them have actually stuck with that sort of disavowal?
again, I can't back this up, or I can't necessarily prove it, but my guess based on my experience with these folks is virtually all of them very quickly kind of came back to him. I think you see a sharpening of I would say sort of like political strategy among certain factions that, folks were sort of quote unquote battle hardened by all these public demonstrations and this sort of movement moment encapsulated by that stop the steal phase. And, some of them kind of moved on and became sort of like what you might call the sort of staunch America First wing, who are those are the types now who might be highly skeptical of Elon Musk and some of the sort of Silicon Valley corporatists, quote unquote. And I think that sort of frustration with that moment has manifested itself in a deeper critique from some segments of the movement that I was engaged with.
Yeah. And, we also talked about how there, the ideology that many folks come into groups that are considered extremist by the mainstream, those ideologies start out being more palatable. perhaps seeming more tame. The idea that we should be proud of certain cultures and the contribution that they've made to society and civilization over time. And then after people come in, things maybe change a little bit. Can you speak to that process?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I feel what you're describing is something that I've seen both with this kind of current patriot movement, the so-called MAGA movement, as well as movements on the left. And historically, many movements have gone through these phases where, people come in with a particular vision or perception of how change happens, how you can change culture, how you can change societies, and then subsequently change the laws of the government that governs those societies. And very often you have these movements where there is an expectation that change happens much quicker than it does in reality. And very, very quickly, many of those folks become disillusioned, but not so just often it's the disillusionment doesn't translate into them leaving the movement. It translates into them sort of becoming quote unquote sort of more radical or more extreme, or feeling like methods of that may start with petitioning your government for grievance might manifest itself in, some sort of direct action or civil disobedience, and then very quickly, move, particularly on the right, move to the space where people feel like democracy maybe is insufficient. And what you have now is this global trend where people are losing faith in democracy's ability to protect their interests, and how they sort of navigate with trying to erode the customs and traditions that really are the scaffolding and the skeleton of any democracy. Folks are very eager to sort of like kick those out from under the table that they're holding up. And so I saw that happen with this movement where folks feel like perhaps like I could feel people feeling like perhaps traditional ways of applying for redress of your grievances are insufficient. And I think that's what you see now with this flood the zone strategy of these EU executive orders, and the executive really trying to consolidate its power and sort of demonstrate that perhaps it doesn't need the other branches of government in order to operate. And that's, very in line with some political ideas that are very alive on the right. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like what you're talking about does also reflect the general lack of trust that is going on within this country, that people don't trust their fellow citizens anymore to act honorably. They don't trust the institutions to be able to give them justice or provide a means of sustaining themselves. And part of that is, it's about social disconnection and what we talked about a little bit earlier in terms of, what types of identities that these folks might feel a bit disconnected from. I would love to hear a little bit more reflection on, what you think that is going on around these folks in terms of the changes to our society, the changes in technology, and the way that even as they have a potential to connect us, maybe they also have a potential to disconnect us.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's so many factors. I mean, I think there's, you have a generation of people, my generation, millennials, and then younger, or people, I was, born in the early 80s, and folks born later who are, grow up in an environment where, we celebrate all perspectives, but often we're told that everyone's right, everyone's opinion is valid, and there's not, and which isn't true and should be the case, but that sort of is often exaggerated into the space where everyone thinks they're right, and our capacity and patience for discourse where we might be in a position where we're wrong is not necessarily is kind of shamed. I think that's exacerbated by social media, where you're sort of encouraged to like plant a flag, and once you plant that flag, sort of that flag is intractable because it's on the internet forever, and you made that position and you can't go back to it. And we live in a culture where we're very critical of people whose opinions might change. Maybe there was a moment in time when we called that evolution or growth, but that's not necessarily what we're how we approach people whose sort of opinions might evolve over time, and I think that's compounded by a bunch of other factors. One of them is this crisis of masculinity, where I think we have this moment where it's men in particular are struggling to define what it means to be a man, what that looks like and what that feels like, and there aren't a lot of public spaces or even private spaces among families and communities for folks to really sort of like digest and think about what that means in a space that's free of shame. And so, because so many of our conversations are full of shame and full of this position where you're winning or losing in any sort of conversation, it's sort of, in my opinion, entrenched people into these perspectives that they may not even necessarily fully agree with, but they've come to so closely associate it with their public identity that to sort of deviate from that might sort of shake an individual's understanding of themselves, and it's like sort of the latest phase in that sort of the alienation and existential crisis of the modern human, if that makes any sense. I don't know if I.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, you had a question I think you wanted to jump in with. He might be a little frozen right now.
Yeah.
Okay, he might be having some connection issues, but I did have a follow-up to that. I mean, the the phenomenon of that kind of social identity is so interesting, and I do wonder if there are what aspects of the movement and the way they operate, the what are the specifics that you can kind of drill down into about what is so appealing uh, within this movement that really gives those folks something to latch onto and some sort of social value.
So I think one of the important containers that exists within the conservative movement in this moment is it's providing a third space. And so, there's this notion of society where you go to home, you have your home, that's one space. You have your job, that's another space. But earlier generations, society and communities had third spaces. They were churches or community places, or, our parents might have been involved or grandparents might have been involved in like the Rotary Club or the Elks Club or a veterans organization or some other sort of community space where people went and gathered and exchanged ideas and found community. And, particularly with this sort of work from home uh, phase thing that's happening now, people barely have any sort of communal space outside of their home. And so I think what is attracting in my experience and what I saw over the course of making this film is I saw this vibrant third space being created by conservative movement and groups like the Proud Boys with their monthly meetups. It was a space where there was, I went to meetups or sort of gatherings where they were trying to invite new members in, where there was no really talking about ideology. Certainly people were performing this sort of conservative macho identity, but it was, in some ways it wasn't that different than, the sports teams that I had grown up with, or the, spaces of young men that I had, a part of as a teenager. And so, and then it was this space that people could come to that was this third space where they get away from their kids, they get away from, the worries of being in other places and just hang out with like-minded people, and in a way that's fun. And there is no comparison that I'm aware of in sort of liberal and progressive, especially left spaces, that compare to that sort of a space of camaraderie and fun that is being provided. I don't even know if it's intentional by conservative movements.
Yeah, and right after this, at this summit where this interview is going to be featured, we are going to be screening this movie Just for Us, which is a stand-up comedian, Jewish stand-up comedian, Alex Edelman, who sits through a white supremacist meeting. And at one point, I remember him thinking about the very banal kind of concerns of the people who organized the meeting, and like the frustrations of like getting all these people together, and just like and just very human stuff that all of us have to deal with, but in a very different setting.
Right.
So that's it's interesting to hear you reflect on that. Dan, I wanted to make sure that you had a chance to jump in.
Well, there's so much we could talk about, but I think you really hit on a very important theme that at least with the Proud Boys, they advertise themselves as just a fun group of guys. And Gavin McGinnis, when he started the group in 2016, he said, we're just like a fraternity, like, the Elks. I think he said the Elks Club or something like that. Uh, and and he's a very funny guy. I mean, he had a podcast and was made a lot of funny jokes. He's just kind of captivating. So this is so multi-layered, as you say. The other side of this, going back to something you said a few minutes ago, when they're engaged in political controversy, of course they think they're right. Everyone's appealing to justice. I'm always struck with extremists of whatever the political ideology, the power of the victim narrative is just so prominent. It's so pervasive that it kind of, we represent the victims and we are the victims. So it's both victimization, personal, individually of the group members, of course, when they're arrested or something, but of course they presumably are acting on behalf of the victim group. For the Proud Boys, of course, it was the whites of European descent and men. Um, did you see that victim narrative that they expressed, and was it not expressed when they kind of hung out together in bars and had fun together? Were they not doing that kind of political narrative? Was it carefully timed at certain points?
That's a good question. It was definitely kind of ever present. I would say even in
Mm-hmm.
casual settings, it was like something that was joked about, or like, oh, you can't do this, you can't say that. Oh,
Oh,
someone would say something in a joke, well, you can't say that.
right.
So it was certainly part of it. And while, this is a common in, conservative and far right movements in Europe and other places, in the US, it takes on this particular complexion, for lack of a better word, because it fits with the American narrative of of the oppressed overcoming adversity and coming to this land and religious freedom or whatever it is. I heard conservatives who were quoting Malcolm X and quoting civil rights heroes, and the civil rights struggle is something that's so by this point it's part of the mainstream American canon of how we understand our heritage and our history, regardless of where you are on the political uh, spectrum. Of course, for the self-identified white nationalists, it's not. But for, folks, I heard, plenty of Proud Boys evoking that, quoting that, at the same time where they would sort of quote Pat Robinson, the intro to his book. So there was this sort of duality happening where that narrative of the sort of victimhood of overcoming oppression was sort of very central to this sort of America First sort of notion that was imbued in both sort of casual conversations and more kind of official pronouncements.
Well,
Right.
fascinating. All right.
And I mean, so you referred to you mentioned the white nationalist ideology, but often in this movie you really see people referring to themselves as Western chauvinists rather than identifying a race as an aspect of their identity. And certainly Thad came from a Latino background, and he did seem to feel common cause with a BLM organizer, right? So it does seem like their understanding of themselves is a bit different from what a lot of other people's understanding of them is. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, the people that are in this film, and a lot of most of the people, we did spend time with sort of outright self-identified white nationalists who center race and the sort of ethno-nationalist perspective. But for the vast majority of the conservatives, the Proud Boys included, they didn't situate themselves like that. There was a whole sort of debate that was happening within Proud Boys, and I saw, there's people in our film like Randy, who are vehemently opposed to the white nationalists and the self-identified sort of neo-Nazis and ethno-nationalists. And I saw this whole fight playing out within the conservative movement among people who self-identify as civic nationalists. Those are the sort of what might fall into the category of the sort of Western chauvinists, the folks who which is a very clever turn of phrase by Gavin McInnes, I'll say, which, are the sort of like, ultra nationalists, but it's this transnational nationalism. Gavin McInnes, of course, is a Canadian. He's not an American. He might be a citizen now, but by birth, he's a Canadian. And we're in this interesting moment where there's this sort of Western nationalism, which kind of permeates that, that's something we could talk more about at another time, but certainly, you could talk about sort of the result of globalization. The irony is the result of globalization and globalized information networks where people are having common cause across borders in a way that perhaps they didn't 20, 30, 40 years ago within these conservative movements. But I saw this real sort of debate happening among self-identified civic nationalists who identify as being people who feel like America should be open to anyone who comes here the right way, does all the right things, but is of any sort of race, creed, or background, who were really at odds and in firm debate with the ethno-nationalists, the sort of Nick Fuentes camp, the sort of self-identified folks who are like, no, 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 we should, separate. We should maybe we keep the country the way it is, but like allow people to, just stick to their own, quote unquote, all the way to the sort of, no, we need to like, separate the Pacific Northwest into its own sort of identitarian sort of place. And it was a real active debate that I was totally surprised to experience because, coming into the conversation, I thought that it was settled, that it was sort of situated around ethno-nationalism or white supremacy. And what I found was much more active debate, which I think is really important to point out because it speaks to how the conservative movement is a multi-tendency movement that is not a fixed ideology, but is composed of many different perspectives that are pushing and pulling against each other for dominance within their movement and control of resources and power within their political movement. So.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, I really appreciate that perspective and the way that your film actually brings that perspective to the audience and complexifies the characters of these folks. So you realize that they are not one dimensional, they're not two dimensional. They are full humans who have conflicted views about their own identities, right? And so yeah, just really grateful for the chance to see that and so to close us out, I even with some of the less toxic ideologies here, there can be a ramp to extremism and even violence, as we saw, obviously. And so I wanted to close with the question of what lets the light in? Really, what sorts of relationships and interactions really help to ground people in more of a shared world where we do have a lot in common and we can actually move forward together rather than trying to blame one another and even eventually leading to victimizing one another.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's the $1 trillion question, right? I think I think there's a lot to be said. It sounds perhaps trite or Pollyanna to say this, but direct engagement and conversation on a personal level about human concerns, what people value, what people want, and trying to engage in those conversations as free of isms and jargon as possible. Because when you really drill down, people are just like looking for security. They're looking for safety. They're looking for a community, whatever that means, and they want to be able to have things left a little bit better for their children. And so when we can sort of drill down past all of this sort of like the way different people perform their identities, I think there's really hope. And that's really the space where the light shines in, when you sort of get past those isms, and because isms are schisms, as Mr. Barley said, you know.
Mm, indeed. Yeah, Dan, did you have anything, any last questions you want to
Yeah,
put?
well, no, I just want to thank you so much for your insight for the film. It's riveting, it's insightful, and I think it is breaks through certain stereotypes that a lot of people may have, just as you're saying, about the reasons why people go into these groups and the evolution of the groups and the complexity of the groups. And our lab is committed primarily for transformation. So this is the first stage, understanding these people as human beings who are complex, um, and being curious about that is a critical stage in transformation. So thank you so much for joining us, and hope to have another similar experience.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an honor to be in conversation with scholars like yourself who are trying to think deeply around these questions as well. And I really hope that I can come back sometime soon and continue the conversation with your community.
All right, great.
Thanks so much, Michael. All right. Well, hopefully you all enjoyed that interview, and I'm trying to I tried to put the link to the film festival where they're going to be showing this film in the DC area. That's going to be next weekend. They've got actually Sunday, April 27th at 4 p.m. At Regal Gallery Place. They are going to be showing that, and the link in the chat that I just dropped, it is not formatted very well, but I believe that should lead you to being able to see that film, because it is absolutely a fascinating look at the Proud Boys and the evolution of these three folks that he follows in their radicalization. So I wanted to just say a few words about some of the phenomena that he talks about in the film and in the interview. One of the themes that I think is so important is connection. And one of the ways that people are find themselves involved in extreme groups, especially groups that have a focus on violence, which, in this film, they did have such a focus on violence, and wanting to get into street brawls. And when people have a sense of disconnection, as you heard Michael talk about, they they really seek out groups that can reinforce their identities. And we have such a sense of disconnection in our society currently as we've migrated to online spaces, and as we've had sorting in our communities where folks from different political ideologies are no longer encountering one another as often as they used to. There is a very deep sense of disconnection. I wanted to show a slide that talks about reinforcing our group separation. Um, and so let me share this with y'all. So this is a slide that I find really interesting to illustrate our sense of disconnection. Um, Back in 1960, only 4% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats said that they would be unhappy if their child married someone of the opposite political party. These days, it is 35% for Republicans and 45% for Democrats that really believe that folks of the other party are no longer morally up to being part of their family. They would prefer to exclude these folks. So I think that is a very telling statistic to show how much separation that not only we have, but that we desire. And when it comes to our identities, which was such a big part of this conversation, we really tend to flatten one another's identities. So this is something that Professor Rothbart and his colleague, Professor Karina Korstalina, have done a lot of research on. And they've come up with a theory called collective axiology. And this theory talks about how identity groups that are opposed to one another tend to see themselves and one another. And it tends to be a feature where many identities are collapsed into one. This is an analogy, a visual analogy I wanted to show people that talks about this is really about the formation of the universe and of planets. So when there was a swirl of gas and dust with our planets forming, there were many different polarities. And then when planets actually came together and formed, like our planet Earth, we have poles, right? So it is the planet is spinning on an axis. And what this shows is that when so many identities come into one, that it becomes a polar identity. There is either one direction or the other, and it gets extremely simplified, and people are no longer able to conceive of the subtleties that come along with our many identities. And what really contributes to this is our disconnection. The fact that we are expressing those identities in very flat and simplistic places. We are increasingly doing so online in social media. And when we do that, we feel the need to represent ourselves. As Michael talked about, we represent ourselves as a strict binary, and we have a fear of being ejected from our groups. So therefore, we have to very strongly express our group identity to not be excluded from that group. And so we really reduce ourselves into this binary to a great detriment and to increasing disconnection. So that's something that we should be increasingly wary of, especially as our society moves to these places where there's not as many third spaces as Michael talked about. So so I wanted to pause there and see if there are any questions from the audience, because I do see some things happening in the chat, and people had some yes. So Quanta, there is a link to the we're going to give a link to the summit where you can register for that. But also in the chat there's a link to the event where you can see this movie, which I think is a really worthwhile. And so if you have any questions that you would like answered live, let's see. So oh, the general educational background of the group. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Malika. Not sure what the background of all three of the folks that we saw in the movie were, but I do know that the leadership of groups like the Proud Boys, groups like Patriot Front, and the Oath Keepers are actually very highly educated, and they present a really nuanced argument to those who are first coming into the group. This is one of the themes that we had explored, that the education level of leadership makes these groups much more palatable, because they are able to convey their ideology in a way that can pass muster for a lot of people when they don't have a lot of familiarity with the groups themselves. So they're brought into these groups with some ideas that can really hang together as coherent before they before it gets to the more toxic elements that are that are introduced a little bit later. Dan, do you have any perspective on this question about and Malika? I want to go ahead and actually allow you to unmute because I see you asked the question and you are yes. But Dan, real
Yeah,
quick, do you
no,
have anything to add on to what I had just mentioned?
no, no, I think you captured it very well. I'd like to hear from people who want to speak. So,
Yeah, please go ahead.
Malika, nice
Yeah,
to meet you.
nice to meet you. Thank you so much, Dr. Daniel. And thank you, Randy, for facilitating such a wonderful discussion. And for the person now who is coming from another country, I think I'm really interested to know about the existence of such groups in the US. So I'm originally coming from the Republic of Tajikistan, and it's also like one of the countries of the former Soviet Union, which is facing the terrorism, extremism issues. And we also have the people who joined the terrorist groups, the terrorist groups in Syria and Iraq, ISIS. So the reason that I ask about the basically like general educational background, because in the past we were thinking about the people, about the Tajik people who were joining the extremist groups are the ones who are coming from low-income families, right? The Tajiks who are in labor migration in Russia, for example, the ones who are in a very marginalized situation. They are basically representing underserved groups of the population. But what is interesting, right now we see more and more people in Tajikistan who are joining those extremist groups, not only extremist groups, but also terrorist groups. But those people are very well educated people. I mean, it's not like, let's say, the person who doesn't have educational background, university background, but the person who graduated, let's say, from one of the top universities in Tajikistan. And when you speak with these students, bright students, they can talk to you on different topics and then they basically make you to change your perception about them, why they join those terrorist groups. That's what I'm saying, the narratives a little bit changed. If in the past Tajikistan was thinking that the people, the Tajiks who are joining the extremist or terrorist groups are the ones who don't have academic, basically like university education, university background, but right now bright students, smart students, they're joining such terrorist groups. Over.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your insights. And it's really, I think you're illustrating a general point that we can't stereotype by education, by economic level, by region in the country. And I don't know the extremists in Tajikistan, although I had the pleasure of being in Dushanbe for some years ago. But yeah, so thank you for your insights.
And I'd like to add one more thing about perception gaps. This is a phenomenon that we have in this country where adding on to the theory of collective axiology that Dan and Karina have developed. The major elements of that theory are a collective generality, which means that we think that folks on the other side are all the same, and we think that we ascribe many of the same characteristics, and that they are negative characteristics, right? So the axiological balance is such that we believe that we are generally right and they are generally wrong, and we misattribute our motivations, right? So we think that we do things for the right reasons and they do things for the wrong reasons. And there is actually a lot of evidence that we get this stuff wrong, and especially folks who have higher education are susceptible to some of these misperceptions even more at a more extreme level. So I actually have some slides that speak to this a little bit. So the perception gap among Republicans and Democrats is pretty big. So we can see that members of each party overestimate the extremism of the other side and underestimate how much they agree with one another. And when we look at how this data changes based on how much they follow the news. Well, if they follow the news most of the time, their perception gap of the other side is bigger, and if they have more education, their perception gap is bigger. And this is actually especially true of Democrats. I think it speaks to an interesting point that we really have to take from this, that, the first of all, the Republican versus Democrat uh, divide in this country is certainly related to the extremism of groups on both sides. So, I think that as Dan showed, there's definitely more violent extremism coming from the right, but it is not exclusive to the right. And the fact is that we threaten one another with our identities, and identity threat is just a huge part of this. We really spin one another up, and and make each other believe that the other group wants to eliminate us, and of course that makes us want to eliminate them. So these are mutually reinforcing phenomena, and I think that that as people are get more education, they often tend to emphasize within that education the negativity of the other groups. So that tends to reinforce this phenomenon, and shows you and how we get to this sort of curve where higher education skews that perception gap more.
Yeah.
So
Randy, that's great insight about the perception gap and part of the distortions that extremists foster and even don't realize that they're distortion. I want to get to someone with hand raised. Is it Quanta Dawn Light?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering if there have been any study made. Right now, what we see is descriptive analysis of the polarized conditions in our country, let's say, or the world. But have there always been any study made that have the effect for depolarizing and finding mutually agreeable uh, points of view on both sides? Like we have a right hand and left hand, but they work together, right? So I was wondering, why is it that the study is always fragmented? Either, you know, these guys are doing this and these guys are doing
Right.
that. How about finding something mutually unifying points of
Right.
view? I don't see that. Or if there is
Right.
one, please let me know. Thank you.
Well, there have been studies, and one reason you don't see it is because there are so many forces through media that Randy just referred to, forces that don't want to show that. There have been studies, and let me just very briefly say to Quanta, there are many, many practices to undermine, to de-radicalize, to undermine the violence of extremist groups, to undermine polarization. There's many, many practices in the field of peace building. One of the challenges is to actually document the efficacy of these practices. And I have seen a few studies on actually testing which practice is actually effective and under what conditions. So there are some studies that have done this. There are many different attempts to de-radicalize, and some are effective. I'm personally fascinated by the attempt in which we basically draw upon former extremists to lead the way in bringing extremists together, bringing their former colleagues together. That's just one technique that I think is promising. So your question, I think, is the central question for our field of fostering transformation, is to promote practices and then to study those. So thank you for that. And I see another hand, Dennis Wang, and I see you're in a car. Drive safely, please.
Thank you very much. And also a Rotarian. So I know we have Carter School and Rotary have a good relationship. One of the things that in looking at the extremists and also all people, I guess, is that we all want some of the same things that was brought up: safety, uh, some prosperity, quality of life, etc. And I just wondered, have there been studies as far as what things that we all agree on?
Mm-hmm.
And can we start with that? Because it seemed like, the whole idea of identity, respect, and, just part of belonging, it seems like we could address these issues. And this is what, Rotary's about. And I'm glad he brought about Rotary as far as being a space where people can get together. And I just wonder what the research has shown as far as where we have things in common that we can build on.
Randy, I know you've spoken often about that. Do you want to take that question?
Yeah, it's certainly true that we have a lot more in common than we realize. Well, for example, I've run a lot of workshops bringing together reds and blues, and at the end of every single one of them, someone says, "Oh, well, we have so much more in common than I realized." And well, speaking of, there's a group I showed some of their research on the screen already. It's called More in Common, and it deals with our perception gaps and also the hidden tribes that exist in this country. And it shows their research on those hidden tribes show that there's an exhausted majority in the middle who agree on so many things. And so that's definitely some research that you should check out. So More in Common is the name of the group, and you can pretty easily find them and their research. And the last thing I'll mention on this is there was also a book called The Rural Voter that I read last year that addressed the perception gap among urban and rural folks and saw and talked about how much overlap there is in terms of policy between urban and rural voters, with one exception. There is one issue where there is not as much overlap, and that's guns, gun rights, gun control, for obvious reasons, for rural folks. But for everything else, there's a lot of alignment. So yes, we do have a ton of alignment that we should really be focusing on that we often don't. Um, that I think that's we're getting to the end of our time. So I wanted to close out with a a quick word on our Peace Lab. So we are part of the Pivot Peace Lab. That stands for Polarization and Violence Transformed. And you can see Dr. Rothbart is our director. I'm managing the lab, and we also have interns. Madison, our intern, one of our interns, is here today, and we're very excited to see her here. I think actually is yeah. So and she'll be chatting some information about our lab. What I also wanted to mention is we are looking for more interns, particularly our number one priority right now is grant research and grant writing. And so we would love to have some people reach out to us. I'll put my email in the chat, and you can reach out if you are interested in an internship with us. We are also looking for people for communications and event planning, other sorts of functions. But like I said, the top priority right now is focusing on grants. And I also wanted to mention the Delta Summit that is coming up. So Delta stands for the Depolarization Labs and Trainers Alliance, and we've got a summit coming up next week. It's next Friday at the Point of View Retreat Center in Lorton, Virginia, which is just an amazing facility. We'll be featuring student research. We'll have students who are going to be presenting their research that's connected to polarization to a panel of professors. And those professors are also going to be then talking about their own research and the frontiers. of that research, where they think is the most exciting directions that they can go. And then also the movie Just for Us, which I mentioned in the video. It's a Jewish comedian who sits through surreptitiously a white supremacist meeting and talks about the limits of empathy and identity issues. And we're gonna have a discussion about that movie afterwards. So this is gonna be a really great event, and we definitely hope that as many people as possible can join us there. So let's see. Yeah, Madison, thanks so much for chatting those links. You can check out our Pivot Peace Lab website, and you can sign up for updates there. And then on the Delta page, you can see the link for the summit. And yeah, and Madison's also chatted the direct link for registration of that summit, and I'm going to also chat my email address. That's right here. So yes, if you are interested in working with our lab, please reach out. So with that, I want to bring this to a close. Dan, would you like any
Yeah.
last words?
Well, just thanks so much for everyone joining and great comments and questions. And it's always wonderful working with you, Randy. We're in the lab, we are changing the world. Okay. So hope to see you all somewhere in another setting, maybe even in person. How radical.
Indeed. Thanks, everyone.